Welcome to this Calvase webinar. Developing more resilient and profitable dairy farms is an important goal for dairy farmers in every country in the world. My presentation is titled Key Determinants of Profit for Dairy Farmers that Utilise Pasture. The presentation will cover the following. What does resilience mean? What can we learn from other countries? Which countries are being successful? Why does a high pasture harvest in a low cost of production system result in more profit and more resilience? How do you develop a low cost of production system? So how do you make a dairy business more resilient? First, we should accept that most dairy industries have a high degree of profit volatility. This graph has return on capital on the vertical axis, which is the truest definition of profit. I've tried to match the colours for each country to some of their national colours. South Africa in green is the most profitable of the countries by quite a large margin. South Africa beats New Zealand in black as land prices in particular, as well as cow prices, are much lower in South Africa, with this being a result of the high personal and political risk in that country. New Zealanders, on the other hand, are known for paying very high prices for land, which does result in their lower return on capital or lower return on total money invested. Noticeably, my country, Australia, in yellow or gold, moves from a more competitive position in the early period, often with a higher level of profitability than New Zealand, to being on average the worst performer in the latter part of the period. I would like you to remember the area highlighted within the red box. Look how Uruguay in dark blue, Argentina in light blue, and Australia all have a higher level of profit than in New Zealand. This is the same graph of profitability over the last 17 years, though trend lines have now replaced joining of the dots on the previous slide. This highlights how South Africa in green, New Zealand in black, and even United States in red all have a positive trend line of increasing levels of profitability. Unfortunately, Uruguay in dark blue, Argentina in light blue, and Australia in yellow have negative trend lines of decreasing levels of profitability. This graph has profit per cow on the vertical axis. Although again, there is lots of volatility for all countries. New Zealand in black is definitely in the strongest position, with South Africa in the next strongest position. Australia in yellow emerges as the weakest of the countries, and given Australian farmers are the most indebted outside New Zealand, this further weakens their position and has resulted in many recent years where farmers have on average been in a loss-making position. Again, look at the area within the red box and see how Uruguay, Argentina, and Australia all have a similar or higher level of profit per cow than in New Zealand. When joining of dots is replaced with trend lines, it confirms Australia is in the worst position of the 6 countries. Uruguay in dark blue looks okay compared to the other countries. Not as good as New Zealand in black, though with similar positive slopes in trend line, such as South Africa and Argentina. This graph has profit per hectare on the vertical axis. Although again, there is lots of volatility for all countries, New Zealand is definitely in the strongest position, with South Africa quite similar. United States is absent, given they don't utilise pasture, but house their cows in barns. Again, when the trend lines are added, New Zealand and South Africa look very good. Australia looks terrible, and Uruguay and Argentina don't look a lot better than Australia. However, it is positive that the Uruguay and Argentina trend lines are slightly positive. So if the level of profitability is volatile for all countries, then the larger the profit margin, the more years will be profitable. This graph has operating profit margin on the vertical axis, which is the percentage of each dollar earned that is retained after all operating expenses are paid. Another way of describing this ratio is that if, say, a farmer had a profit margin of 15%, then they are keeping 15 cents in each dollar that they earn after paying for all expenses, including maintaining their plant and machinery and receiving a salary for the time they work. This leaves this 15 cents in each dollar for paying interest and principal on any loans and for investing within the business or using the funds elsewhere. Although there is a lot of volatility in this ratio, New Zealand is clearly in the strongest position and South Africa in the next strongest position. Uruguay in dark blue and Argentina in light blue appear to be in a much better position than Australia and the United States. When the trend lines are added, the separation of the countries into two groups becomes clear. New Zealand and South Africa have increasing profit margins over the time period, and United States is maintaining its profit margin. Remember, the United States has cows in barns, which are often producing around 9,000 to 11,000 litres per cow, so they can remain profitable with a lower margin per litre. The other three countries, Uruguay, Argentina, and Australia, have decreasing profit margins as well as their lower levels of profit. Uruguay does have a higher profit margin than Argentina and Australia. And the big challenge I would set for farmers in Uruguay is to get out of the poor performance group with Argentina and Australia and join the high performing group with New Zealand and South Africa. This graph shows the growth in annual milk production in the 6 countries using 2002-03 as a base of 1. Uruguay in dark blue looks impressive, though like Argentina, the annual growth in milk supply has decreased or even stopped in recent years. Australia in yellow is clearly the sickest industry, given it has suffered negative growth over the last 17 years. Once the trend lines are added, the split between the 3 countries with consistent growth match those with the most consistent trends in profitability and profit margin. These countries are New Zealand, South Africa, and United States. Australia and Argentina look particularly poor, with both having decreases in national milk supply in recent years. Again, the challenge for Uruguay is to alter the recent trends of lowering profitability and low growth in milk supply and reset growth to imitate New Zealand and South Africa. Changes in milk price are the most significant reason for volatility in profit, though other factors like supplement cost or variations in pasture growth can also have a big impact. And although milk prices remain volatile, the variations in milk price between countries is reducing. This graph has milk price in US cents per litre of energy corrected milk. There are a number of interesting factors to highlight here. New Zealand milk price in black is the most volatile, given that country's almost total reliance on their export market. South Africa, in green, does have an advantage over all countries except the United States through to 2011, which is what would have historically been expected given their domestic production focus, though this advantage has disappeared in recent years. The United States milk price is almost always significantly higher than for all these other countries, which may be an initial warning for those advocating Southern Hemisphere countries learn from or imitate the United States production system. From around 2007, milk prices are quite similar for Uruguay, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and South Africa. So milk price doesn't explain any of the differences in financial performance of these countries, nor can it explain why some countries are doing better and others poorer. When the trend lines are added, the most important factor is how each country's milk price has been progressively getting closer to the other countries. This narrowing of the difference between international milk prices, regardless of hemisphere or region, appears to have been accelerated over the period from 2007 to 2013 by the huge increase in imports of milk products by China and the huge increase in exports of milk products by the United States. So, if you want to develop a dairy business that is more resilient, then you need to reduce the cost of production so that there is a larger profit margin in all years. So now let's look at the trends for cost of production per litre, arguably the most important single measure outside return on capital for dairy businesses to monitor. Why? Because maintaining a low cost of production per litre that is competitive with other export-focused countries is essential, especially as the world has become more interconnected. Even most domestic-focused dairy industries are now exposed to imported dairy products, so they need to be able to compete with these products on price. The table outlines how cost of production is calculated, and by deducting livestock revenue and any other non-milk revenue from total expenses. This allows the cost of production, 28 cents per litre in this instance, to be compared directly to milk price at 33 cents per litre, with the difference in this instance being the profit margin of 5 cents per litre. You can see in this graph that Uruguay and Argentina had the lowest cost of production of all the countries from 2003 to 2007. And you'll remember that over this period, both countries were more profitable than New Zealand. However, since then, the cost of production in both Uruguay and Argentina has increased at a much higher rate than New Zealand, United States, and South Africa. The United States, in red, has a substantially higher cost of production throughout the entire period, which might make some of you wonder why so many farmers in Argentina and Australia, and to some degree in Uruguay, have been adopting US-type production systems. When the trend lines are added, it is even clearer how rapidly cost of production has been increasing in Uruguay. This is further highlighted in the table, which includes the compound annual growth rate or year-on-year increase in cost of production for the 6 countries. 3 countries have higher increases, including Uruguay, Argentina, and Australia, and the other 3 have much lower increases. Remember, it is the 3 with lower increases in cost of production that have been consistently increasing milk supply and growing their dairy industry over the last 20 years, whereas the other 3 countries have all at some point stopped growing. So how do you reduce the cost of production? Firstly, you increase pasture harvest or maximize it. This graph describes the relationship of pasture harvest to profit from a statistical perspective using an Australian data set. On the vertical axis is return on capital, and on the horizontal axis is pasture harvest. The R-squared value is high at 0.41, and this is the factor with the highest correlation to profit of any ratios, apart from total profit or total margin ratios. This second graph on the right describes the relationship of pasture harvest to cost of production. On the vertical axis is cost of production, and on the horizontal axis is pasture harvest. The R-squared value is 0.14, and this confirms how increasing pasture harvest drives down the cost of production, which supports the increase in profitability. So if a high and increasing cost of production is at the heart of the loss in profit in Uruguay, Argentina, and Australia, is this due to poor performance in the area of pasture harvest? In this graph of pasture harvest, Uruguay and Argentina have the lowest pasture harvest per hectare per year at around 5 tonne dry matter per hectare, and Australia is next at around 8 tonne dry matter per hectare. New Zealand has the highest level of pasture harvest, and South Africa in green has done an impressive job of closing the gap with New Zealand. Both countries have a huge natural advantage in pasture production compared to the other countries. New Zealand largely without the need or cost of irrigation, and South Africa with the addition of irrigation. When the trend lines are added, you can see that 4 of the 5 countries have made very little progress, if any, in increasing pasture harvest. The exception is South Africa, which has made fantastic progress through the addition of irrigation, as well as a huge focus on adopting new knowledge in relation to increasing pasture harvest. What I think is very interesting is that New Zealand has made little, if any, progress in increasing pasture harvest over the last 17 years. And yet it has done very well at maintaining a low cost of production. This is further highlighted in the table of year-on-year percentage increases, where you can see no change for New Zealand. You will remember from the profit graphs that in the early years highlighted in red in this graph, Uruguay, Argentina, and Australia all had higher profitability than New Zealand. I hope you can also remember that Uruguay and Argentina had a lower cost of production in this early period. Now it is clear from the black New Zealand pasture harvest line that New Zealand has not improved its position compared to any of the other countries in the last 15 to 20 years. So pasture harvest is important, but it does not explain any of the loss in profitability or loss in competitiveness compared to New Zealand, for Uruguay, or the other countries. So in addition to pasture harvest, and I would suggest maybe more important than pasture harvest, is that farmers develop a low cost of production system. You define a production system by the percentage of pasture in the total diet of the cow. This graph plots changes in pasture as a percent of the total diet, or the change in the production systems. New Zealand stands out with its very high percent of pasture in the diet. Once trend lines are included and the table of change over the 17-year period is added, it is evident that New Zealand has changed its production system little over this period, with pasture harvest continuing to be over 75% of the diet. Like farmers in other countries, New Zealand farmers do increase the use of supplements and push up their cost of production when milk price is high, but they reverse most, if not all of this, when milk price turns down. However, all 4 of the other countries have large decreases in pasture as a percent of the diet, with Australia and Argentina having the largest decreases. And it is Argentina and Australia where the steepest increases in cost of production and loss of profitability have occurred. These changes have coincided with significant increases in the amount of concentrate fed per cow and the continuing breeding of larger US-type cows. This change in production system is also at the heart of what has been eroding Uruguayan dairy farmers' profitability. So low cost of production comes from having a high percent of pasture in the diet. This table might help with understanding the impact on cost of production as less pasture is fed per cow and more concentrate and other supplements are fed. The table includes the production and/or purchase cost of pasture, concentrate, and forage, and then calculates the ratio of concentrate and forage cost to pasture cost. The ratio of concentrate cost and forage cost to pasture cost is the key here. Look at the scale of this for, say, concentrates in Uruguay, where they are on average 220% more expensive than pasture, or in Australia, where they are 240% more expensive than pasture. Forage costs are also very significantly more expensive than pasture, although not to the same extent as concentrates. So as more and more low-cost pasture is replaced with hugely more expensive supplements in the cow's diet, the cost of production generally increases. This graph outlines the cost of total feed per litre. These costs include all concentrate, forage and pasture costs, as well as young stock or heifer rearing feed costs. So as pasture becomes a lower percentage of the diet, the average cost of feed increases per tonne. This increase in cost per tonne is of such a large quantum that it increases the cost of feed per litre. New Zealand has easily the lowest cost of feed per litre of the group. Although the United States price of concentrates and forages per tonne are lower than almost all other countries in the world, the total cost of feed per litre is much higher than for all other countries in the group. Once again, although this may be a sustainable position for the US given their higher milk price, it is certainly a big warning for all the other countries not to adopt the US production systems if you're exposed to internationally traded milk prices. When the trend lines are added, Argentina and Uruguay have moved from having total feed costs similar to New Zealand at the start of the period to being much higher than New Zealand and closer to the United States by the end. This table breaks total expenses per litre down into total feed cost plus labour cost plus all other costs and includes a calculation of the percentage of total expenses each of these entail. As the table confirms, the cost of feed comprises around 40 to 60% of total costs for farms utilising pasture and around 60 to 70% for confinement farms. Labour costs are the next largest cost for farms utilising pasture at around 15 to 25% of total costs. And all the balance of the costs make up around another 20 to 35% of total costs. So cost of feed is the dominant cost in any dairy business. And if a group of farmers or an industry wants to significantly change its cost of production, then this must be the area where the main changes are implemented. This graph outlines the total operating expenses per litre, so all the costs included. Since 2009, New Zealand has had the lowest operating expenses per litre, and the United States has the highest expenses over the entire period. Uruguay and Argentina start the period with the lowest expenses, but from 2012 have the next highest expenses after the United States. Australia commences the period with similar operating expenses to New Zealand, but has also progressively increased expenses to a level that is similar to Argentina. The trend lines further highlight these changes and confirm how important it is for many farmers in Uruguay to reverse this trend. I'd like to briefly describe some of the changes that happen as production systems change from a statistical perspective, using a large, unbiased Australian data set. This graph shows the relationship of pasture percent in the diet to profit. On the vertical axis is return on capital, and on the horizontal axis is the percent of pasture in the cow's diet. The R-squared value is low at 0.08, though it is statistically significant. I've now added two other graphs. At top right is the relationship of pasture percent in the diet to profit per cow. This has an R-squared value of 0.12, and this is also statistically significant while having a similar shaped curve. At bottom right is the relationship of pasture percent in the diet to profit per hectare. This has an R-squared value of 0.07, and it is again statistically significant, while also having a similar shaped curve. What these graphs highlight is that as the percent of pasture in the diet decreases or reduces, profit reduces at an increasing rate. This slide now highlights some of the main areas of impact as pasture percent decreases in the diet. Firstly, at top left, cost of production increases as pasture percent of the diet decreases. Secondly, at top right, pasture consumed per cow decreases as pasture percent of the diet decreases. Thirdly, both supplement costs per litre at bottom left and total feed costs per litre at bottom right increase substantially as pasture percent of the diet decreases. This slide highlights more of the main areas of impact as pasture percent decreases in the diet. At top left, pasture cost per tonne dry matter increases as pasture percent of the diet decreases. Secondly, at top right, pasture harvest decreases as pasture percent of the diet decreases, a particularly important outcome. Thirdly, core cow costs increase at bottom left as pasture percent of the diet decreases. And finally, at bottom right, labour cost per cow increases as pasture percent of the diet decreases. So you can see how decreasing pasture as a percent of the diet has this huge negative impact on so many areas in a farming business. There is another essential factor to having a highly profitable dairy farm, which is that you need to implement a management plan with excellence. So yes, it is very important to design a low cost of production system with lots of pasture in the cow's diet. And yes, you must aim to maximize pasture harvest. and develop your plan for success. But none of this will be successful if you don't implement daily management well. What does implement daily management well mean? Firstly, you need to make daily management decisions at the right time. And secondly, you need to execute the decisions accurately. However, to do this, you need a good team, you need good tools like infrastructure and machinery, and you need to make sure that everyone focuses on implementing the plan well. Gonzalo is going to talk more about this. So in summary, to build more resilient and sustainable dairy businesses, lowering the cost of production is the most important outcome. Increasing pasture harvest is one important option to reduce the cost of production, and the choice of production system is the other. Changing the production system by significantly increasing the percent of pasture in the diet will reduce cost of production. However, this may require a change in cow type for many farms, which means changing production systems take time. So start now. And under all circumstances, implement the chosen strategy accurately and on time. Thank you. I have 3 questions in relation to my presentation that I've been asked to answer. The first question: how would I convince farmers to change their focus when they love their cows and want to maximize individual cow production, when they say that improving profit is all about increasing milk production per cow in order to dilute costs and to improve feed conversion efficiency? This is a very good question, and the answer might depend on the farmer. If they were someone who was interested in reading publications, then I would initially provide them links to some economic or scientific papers that would challenge their thinking. If they were someone that already analysed the financial performance of their farm in detail, then I might provide them some comparative farm performance data that would highlight how the more profitable farmers do not necessarily produce more milk per cow. If they were someone who was part of a study group of farmers that I was also familiar with, then I would discuss with them which of the farmers were producing the higher levels of profit and what were the most common characteristics of these top performing farms. However, most importantly, I would convince the farmer to complete a whole farm business analysis, and to do this in such a way that it would be clear what parts of the business were performing well and which were not performing well. This first step of analysing the business is essential, as this can change the discussion from what the farmer feels is going well with the farm to a discussion about the real performance. The next step is to take the present performance of the farm and create some scenarios. One of these scenarios could be to continue to focus on higher milk production per cow, so that the farmer can see if this will have a positive, neutral, or negative impact on profit. Other scenarios would include increasing pasture harvest per hectare and increasing pasture as a percent of the diet, as I outlined in my presentation. The most important aspect of this is that you use a whole farm approach to analyse the business. What do I mean by a whole farm approach? This involves an acceptance that the outcomes from farm management decisions are the result of a combination of all things. So, to determine the solution to a problem related to part of the farm production system requires a solution to the whole production system, and all inputs and their marginal contributions to output need to be considered when considering changes to a farm production system. For instance, to quantify the impact on financial performance of a change to pasture production by adding more nitrogen, or a change to milk production by adding more concentrate requires an analysis of the impact on all areas of the business. This will include the impact on people to manage the pasture and to manage the cows, the impact on vehicles and machinery to manage the pasture and the cows, the impact of substitution from feeding more pasture or more concentrate to the cows, and the possible requirements for more cows to consume the extra pasture due to the extra nitrogen that was applied, or from the substituted pasture as a result of the extra concentrate being fed. So to convince a farm that they needed to change their focus from the cows and milk production per cow to focusing on a more profitable production system that included increasing pasture harvest and more pasture consumed per cow, I would want to use an analysis of the financial performance of their business and how this change of focus would allow them to increase their profit. Question 2. Which indicator is better? Profit per cow, profit per hectare, or profit per litre? Surely we don't want to use too many indicators. It is certainly true that we do not want to use too many indicators, but it is equally true that no single ratio can describe a farm business. Return on capital defines profit, so this is the best indicator of them all. Profit per cow or per hectare are quite good proxies for return on capital. And as these are a little easier to calculate, one of these could be used to monitor performance. Both refer to capital, either cows or land, so either could be used. Profit per litre is a quite different indicator, as it does not refer to a unit of capital, but refers to a unit of output, milk. So it is a margin ratio or a risk ratio. Operating profit margin is another margin or risk ratio. One of these two ratios would be good to add to your bucket of 10 to 12 ratios that you monitor for a farm and which form part of your whole farm approach analysis. You also need some pasture ratios, as we have discussed already, as well as some supplement ratios, some people efficiency ratios, a cow cost ratio, and a hectare cost ratio, so that you can monitor all the important areas that, when combined, produce the level of profit in the business. If a farm has any debt, then there may also be a need to monitor a couple of solvency ratios. I've recently produced a paper that identifies what these core group of 10 to 12 ratios should be if a farmer or consultant wanted to monitor business performance and develop plans to increase farm profit. Third question is, what would I recommend to a group of farmers that are wanting to decrease their cost of production? As I've outlined in my presentation, the goal of decreasing cost of production is the same goal as to increase profit. These are important goals for farmers if they want to remain competitive with other dairy farmers, not only in Uruguay, but also with farmers in other countries around the world. For farmers to decrease their cost of production, they need to increase pasture harvest, increase the percent of pasture in the diet, and implement daily management well, as we have discussed. It is also very important to use the whole farm approach to analysing opportunities to improve financial performance. This requires that farmers analyse their farm business and monitor a group of ratios to see what is improving and what is not improving in their business. Farmers then need to have a definite plan for what needs to change and what they need to focus on to decrease cost of production and increase profit. What else would I recommend to a group of farmers? I would also recommend that they become part of a study group with other farmers that have a similar goal to analyse their business and focus on goals that will reduce their cost of production, increase their profit, and create a more resilient farm business. These groups can be very effective and productive if they share their farm business analysis with each other so that they can learn from each other. I've been involved in many farmer groups like this in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Within these groups, there are usually farmers that are very good in some areas of performance and not so good in other areas, which means everyone can learn something from other farmers in the group. Many of these groups have been meeting for well over 10 years now. The important principle is that members of the group are open and honest with each other, and they share the real financial position and level of performance of their business with everyone else in the group. That completes my presentation. Thank you.